Venezuela 101.
We wish to inform our listeners that for the production of this episode, the voices have been dubbed from Spanish to English using artificial intelligence.
Welcome to Venezuela 101. This special episode dives deep into the latest report published by the UN Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela in October 2024. The document provides crucial insights into the political context, human rights violations, and the electoral situation in the country. The UN Fact-Finding Mission on Venezuela was established by the UN Human Rights Council in 2019 as part of the same resolution renewing the mandate of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. Its purpose is to investigate and document human rights violations in Venezuela, particularly in the context of the political and social crisis affecting the country. Following the publication of this latest report at the Human Rights Council and the interactive dialogue among member states on its findings, the mission's mandate was renewed for another 2 years. This highlights the importance of documenting and preserving historical records for victims and ensuring justice for crimes against humanity committed in Venezuela. This report covers the period from September 1st, 2023 to August 31st, 2024 and documents a worsening human rights situation, particularly in the aftermath of the presidential elections. The report highlights acts of repression before and after the elections held on July 28th, where thousands of Venezuelans took to the streets following the electoral fraud perpetrated by the regime. The response from security forces alongside armed civilian groups aligned with the regime was violent and deliberate. The mission notes that after the 2023 primary elections, which Maria Corina Machado won, what seemed like a step toward democracy soon turned into a series of repressive actions, marking the beginning of political persecution witnessed before, during, and after the presidential elections. The persecution included not only criminal investigations against opposition leaders, but also arbitrary detentions, political persecution, and threats. The report reveals that between September 2023 and May 2024, at least 60 individuals were arbitrarily detained, many subjected to unfair trials. These detentions were primarily carried out by CBIN and DGCIM, state security forces already identified in previous reports for abuses of power, torture, and crimes against humanity. Regarding the presidential election, the mission stated that the process was riddled with irregularities. The National Electoral Council, CNE, theoretically an independent body, faced criticism after its October 2023 reconstitution for clear pro-government bias. For instance, the CNE president, Elvis Amoroso, has a political history tied to the regime. The report highlights irregularities in candidate nomination processes. On March 25th, the CNE excluded 13 parties from the presidential election, including 2 part of the opposition unitary platform. Additionally, opposition candidates faced regime interference with their registrations obstructed. The July 28, 2024 elections were marred by allegations of fraud and lack of transparency. Ballot tally sheets were withheld and the CNE declared the regime victorious without completing the vote count. As we discussed in previous episodes, this sparked nationwide protests met with state violence and repression. Over 900 demonstrations demanded transparency in the electoral results, resulting in more than 2,000 arbitrary detentions, 25 deaths, and hundreds of injuries. The repression was brutal and, according to the mission, unprecedented. The regime launched Operation Tuntun, which involved mass arrests of protest participants or anyone expressing opposition. Activists, political leaders, children, and individuals with disabilities were among the victims. The report also documented cases of torture in detention centers, including electric shocks, suffocation, beatings, and sleep deprivation. These methods were used to force detainees, particularly children and young people, to record videos confessing to being paid by the opposition to participate in violent protests and property destruction. Such abuses remain a systematic practice by state security forces. The fact-finding mission has consistently documented a pattern of egregious human rights violations. It's crucial to highlight the role of armed civilian groups, known as colectivos, in these protests. These groups, aligned with the government, operated with impunity and coordinated with state security forces. The Venezuelan Observatory of Social Conflict, OVCS, reported that armed civilian groups intervened in 119 of these protests. Videos analyzed by the mission show these armed civilians shooting at protesters without any intervention from security forces. While the country rose to demand electoral transparency, the regime responded not only with violence, but also with a campaign of mass arrests. According to the report, these arrests were arbitrary, lacked judicial warrants, and were based on unfounded accusations. The pattern resembles prior protests in 2014 and 2017. Alarmingly, the report documented a sharp increase in the detention of minors, with at least 150 children and adolescents arrested, many accused of terrorism or incitement to hatred. The mission explains that under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, minors must be treated with dignity and respect and cannot be charged with serious crimes without evidence. However, these rights were not upheld. All detained minors were treated as adults, many arrested without being caught in the act of protest. In some cases, minors were subjected to sexual violence while in custody. The mission documented at least 5 cases of sexual violence in detention centers in the electoral context up to the report's closure. This coercion during judicial processes illustrates the destruction of the rule of law in Venezuela and how Nicolas Maduro's government has intensified its strategy of repression and persecution against dissent. The report also highlights a pattern of impunity. Despite thousands of documented human rights violations, there have been no independent investigations or legal consequences for perpetrators. The mission emphasizes that these violations are not isolated incidents, but part of a long-standing strategy of repression. Similar abuses were reported during the protests of 2014 and 2017. The fact-finding mission has documented crimes against humanity as part of a deliberate plan to silence and dismantle political opposition. Among its conclusions, the mission provides detailed accounts of the regime's functioning, stating that since October 2023, within the framework of an electoral year, the state reactivated its machinery of repression to carry out actions aimed at dismantling and demobilizing organized political opposition. The grave human rights violations detailed in this document resulted from the conscious and planned operation of that machinery. Following the presidential elections of July 28, 2024, authorities intensified and accelerated the harshest and most violent form of repression to silence opposition or perceived opposition figures. Similarly, the mission asserts there are reasonable grounds to believe that arbitrary deprivations of life, arbitrary detentions, short-term enforced disappearances, acts of torture, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, as well as sexual and gender-based violence have occurred. Although these cases represent only a sample of a much larger universe, they illustrate how the state's machinery of repression has operated and continues to operate. The situation in Venezuela remains critical, with systematic human rights violations deepening. This underscores the need for continued attention and action by international mechanisms and the global community to ensure justice, reparations for victims, and guarantees of non-repetition. What we witnessed today is the result of years of abuse. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Don't forget to follow us on social media, subscribe, and share this episode. Until next time.
In addition to our personal accounts at Miguel Pizarro and at Melanio Bar, you can also follow us on Instagram as @Venezuela101_.
Remember, you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Venezuela 101.